Have you ever wondered what else was found inside Viet Cong tunnels during the Vietnam War? Or what happened to the deceased and wounded soldiers and civilians down there? Can you imagine what death looked like in those dark, narrow spaces, or what occurred when two enemies met face to face? A savage, animal-like fight in total darkness while others listened from above or below, unable to help. Some tunnel rats discovered underground hospitals filled with people in such horrifying conditions that the memories haunted them for the rest of their lives. There are many videos about tunnel rats and how terrible their job was, but today we're going to show you some of the darkest and most disturbing things that happened or were found in these infamous tunnels, and to unlock you a new set of fears. So, brace yourself. US Army tunnel rat James Gillum remembers crawling in complete darkness and silence through a narrow Viet Cong underground tunnel. In his mind, he repeated the most important rules he had learned from the experienced tunnel rats. Never turn on the light unless you're absolutely sure you're alone. Use your senses for orientation, and if you encounter someone, try to kill them as quietly as possible to avoid alerting others. That day, he had a tense, strange feeling as he silently followed the enemy through the tunnel. At a bend in the corner, in pitch-black darkness, he thought he was alone until he smelled someone's breath. A fierce hand-to-hand fight broke out in the tunnel, with James barely winning before quickly making his way out. He never knew who that person was, their gender or their age, but that day, along with that unknown person, the civilized version of the tunnel rat died. James Gillum was among the lucky ones who managed to get out alive, but seriously affected for life by this experience. Many others are still down there, went into the tunnel, and never got out, while some were pulled out dead coming upon booby traps, the enemy dead ends, or flooded or collapsed tunnels. Before mentioning how they face some of the worst ways imaginable to die, let's talk about some findings, ranging from unusual and unexpected to purely disturbing. Something you wouldn't expect or believe could be found in narrow tunnels is definitely a tank. A captured M48 American tank was found 6 feet underground, with several connecting tunnels to it. When captured, the tank was buried and interconnected with the tunnel system by other smaller tunnels and was in fully operational condition with working lights, batteries, and radio. It was used as a Viet Cong command center underground and was saved to be sent to the Soviet Union. Viet Cong had a widespread tunnel network even during the conflict with France, and when the new war started, this system was only expanded with 8 decades worth of digging. Hundreds of miles of tunnels were dug, especially underneath areas where key military operations were taking place, even connecting villages or passing beneath the perimeters of American bases. The Cu Chi district was the region where the tunnels were most widespread, right under the American positions. This district became the most bombed, shelled, gassed, defoliated, and generally devastated area in the history of warfare, with an average of 6,500 bombs falling each day. However, what frustrated US forces was that despite the enormous firepower, it seemed like they couldn't do anything against the enemy. The bombardment exposed some of the tunnels and collapsed some sections, but again, it couldn't do any major damage. They slowly realized that to understand the tunnels and destroy them effectively, someone had to go inside. Besides being used for movement and shelter, many other things were happening inside the tunnels. Even after discovering them, American and Australian tunnel rats who went in to explore them were not remotely aware of how extensive these networks were. The soil was soft and easy to dig by hand, and when exposed to air due to the high iron content, the soil hardened like concrete. This allowed for extensive digging on multiple levels, with a developed system for water and ventilation. There were underground hospitals, kitchens, factories, classrooms, and even temporary prisons. The tunnels were ingeniously designed to withstand even the heaviest bombings, gas attacks, or flamethrowers, while at the same time making the most unpleasant welcome for unwanted guests. Maybe the tank was a cool find in the tunnels, but what you really don't want to see is this. A slightly larger room where, after crawling, you could finally stand up. The stench was awful, even worse than the normally suffocating and heavy air of the tunnels, and soon the tunnel rat would see why. This room was different from the others. It was white, with American parachutes covering the walls all around. In the middle was a table with a light over it, electrically powered by a modified bicycle. Then you realize it was an operating room. In these horrific conditions, surgeons operated on and treated wounded Viet Cong fighters with the little resources they had, often with no anesthetics and antibiotics. Captain Lin, commander of the 7th VC Battalion, who spent 5 years living underground, said that the wounded in underground aid stations would scream just for one look at light or one breath of air. Finding the operating room and evidence of what happened there and in what conditions is something you remember for life, let alone endure it. Tunnel rats would also find deceased Viet Cong fighters, or even living ones, in conditions that couldn't be described. The dead were either left to decompose in the tunnels if they couldn't be moved, or were shallowly buried in the walls. Who knows what else is buried down there? Some tunnel rats got lost or ended up in dead-end tunnels with no way to go back. There were traps designed to collapse the section of tunnel behind them or flood it with water. Others were set to activate poisonous gas, release snakes, scorpions, or spiders, and rats and bats were often crawling or flying over them. One of the more unsettling discoveries was torture rooms, where evidence showed prisoners had been held, with no way of knowing what was done to them or where they ended up. The tunnels were also used to transport and hide prisoners, and there was an instance where South Vietnamese soldiers were found chained in underground rooms. Life in the tunnels was far from pleasant or safe. The majority of the tunnels were claustrophobic, dark, damp, rat and bug-infested burrows that were no wider than 47 inches and no higher than 48 inches. Small holes were dug into the walls of the tunnels in the shape of beds where people slept. Imagine hundreds of people living, eating, cooking, and using the toilet in narrow, underground spaces. We'll talk more about the dead in a second. That's a horror in itself. The tunnels were usually built on multiple levels. The first level was for fighting men, the second for hospitals and factories, while the third, deeper underground, housed entire families. American tunnel rats rarely reached these deeper levels because the first level was already dangerous enough. Finding the entrance to the tunnels happened rarely, as they were very skillfully hidden and well guarded, surrounded by various traps. The entrances and exits to the tunnels were made as small and narrow as possible, where barely one man at a time could go through, and even when they found and destroyed a section of the tunnel or collapsed it, it was only one of many openings in the complex tunnel system, so they didn't cause much damage. The firepower superiority of the American troops was now completely useless. The Viet Cong knew the tunnel network very well and designed it to make entry for the Americans as difficult and deadly as possible. The first tactic was to dig the tunnels in slight curves, so light and bullets couldn't travel very far. Shafts and trapdoors were some of the deadliest threats. They never knew if an enemy soldier was waiting below or on the other side of a trapdoor until it was too late. The Viet Cong fighter would wait right by the tunnel opening, waiting for someone to get close. A US Army veteran recalls seeing a young soldier in front of him who was new to the tunnel rat job and didn't fully understand what he was doing. He crawled right up to the edge of a tunnel, and just as he put his head through, he was shot in the face by a Viet Cong fighter who had been sitting right there, waiting. Another, much more horrific technique was using a steel rod or sharpened bamboo stick. Now, I can't fully describe it here in detail, but I think you will understand. The Viet Cong fighter would wait in a small hole on the side or beneath the main tunnel for an enemy soldier to come through with his body or stick his head out. Then he would use this rod or stick to pin the enemy soldier, if you know what I mean. That would stuck and heavily wound the soldier, leaving him unable to do anything, while the sounds of that event would terrify the other soldiers behind him and flush them out of the tunnel, never to return. But beyond that, this did something else. The pinned body now sealed the tunnel, and no one could pass through it. This has been described as one of the worst things you could hear in a tunnel, especially since it lasted long, and the sound was simply indescribable. Tunnel rat veterans described the tension they felt in the tunnel as the greatest of their lives, where their senses were heightened beyond measure, and their bodies reacted to the slightest perceived movement, sound, or smell in the darkness. One said that at the slightest sign, he would start shooting and screaming at the same time under such immense pressure. He also said that such a reaction was key in tunnel warfare, because those who hesitated even for a fraction of a second always lost to the enemy. Some were so shocked and paralyzed by fear that they gave the enemy a crucial time window to act first, and they never left the tunnel they went into.